This is Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And now your host, Michael O'Fallon.
We are in the midst of a transition from an analog, objective, scientific method-based world of abundance and into a digital, radically subjective, alchemy-based world of scarcity. And how the authoritarians are going to make this all happen is that they are going to fracture our nation to bits and set us all at war against one another in endless spiraling dialectical warfare struggles. And many of you, even some of you, who have been listening to me for the last 7 years, are going to help them achieve their goals. Now, after listening to today's show, I hope some of you will reverse that path and help us to save our nation. And although we have mentioned this in years past, that goal that they have has been to create a Weimar Germany of the 1920s, that kind of scenario. How this will all happen will be of epic proportions, unless we stop it from happening. Please understand that. But this group identity game that they're playing, it ends in blood. And now both the woke progressive left and the neo-integralist far-right Christian nationalists have taken this awful path. And as I reviewed with my podcast from 2023 on The Big Sort, the attempt will be to balkanize the United States of America. And to be successful at fracturing the nation, you have to eliminate all past unity and make sure that all ethnicities and just about every single identity group hate one another. So what has been happening on both the progressive left and the neo-integralist right is the attempt to divide all of us and encourage us to fight one another. So you divide the United States by our identity categories, you divide us by race, you divide us by ethnicity, you divide us by language, you divide us by sexual identity, you divide us by religion, and you create the Hobbesian battleground that Jordan Peterson has been warning about for the past decade. To set us all at war with one another. And to do all of this while demolishing our economy and create the circumstances for the largest divide and conquer play in the history of mankind. You see, these are the steps to genocide. And they are attempting to unleash this on America. Now, if you have never heard about the 10 steps that lead to genocide, and various versions are on many different websites, you can look them up, and I'll provide some of those here at the bottom of the page. Well, you're about to. If you have heard the 10 steps of genocide in years past when talking about, let's say, Nazi Germany, Poland, France, Austria, the Netherlands, Cambodia, well, you're about to hear it again. But this time, I want to make sure that you frame your review of the 10 steps in the light of what's happening around us, with the big sort, and with the rise of all sorts of forms of integralism in America, which is almost always accompanied with some sort of anti-Semitism, every single time. And think about how the LGBTQ+ communities are now referring to Christians and conservatives as their mortal enemies. Think about the rise of the Black Lives Matter movements and the far woke ideology that sees whites or white supremacy as the source of all evil. And now think about how that identity group has merged with the radical pro-Muslim groups, the ones that you see all over college campuses, to give a wink and a nod to the calls for the eradication of the Jewish people from the planet. And think about the reaction from the Jewish community towards the radical Islamics. Just think about those things as we talk through the 10 stages to genocide. Stage number 1, classification. The first stage is the classification stage. People are divided into them and us, where someone who is different from us ethnically, religiously, philosophically just can't be tolerated anymore. So we'll have to have the radical Black Lives Matter crowd saying that they just can't live under white supremacy anymore. And you will now have the Christian nationalists saying that they just can't live with the liberals anymore. And the progressives will say that they just can't live with the Christian nationalists anymore. As a matter of fact, you'll have someone named Alexander Dugin saying he just can't live with the United States anymore. We, or us, can't live with them. Think back to the masked and the unmasked, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Every single way that you could pit one American against another American. And this will lead to the second stage. Stage number 2. When combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of pariah groups. They'll be told they need to wear something to signify them. So when you see a Muslim symbol, you recoil. Or when a Protestant sees a crucifix, they recoil. Or when someone who follows Andrew Torba sees a Jewish star, his head spins around 6 times and he vomits. Or when someone who is Jewish now feels persecuted when they see an Islamic symbol or a cross. They feel threatened. So after the first stage of us and them, you now have the beginning of some start of confirmation bias. And whenever they see the symbols, they immediately think back to the us versus them, which leads to stage number 3, discrimination. And I need you to think back about 6 years ago, when groups in Christianity like the Gospel Coalition were having people of color only Christian meetings. Seriously, they were discriminating against whites, which of course was a mid-level provocation that would naturally turn into white identitarianism. So unless you understood the game that was being played against you and others of your collective affinity group, and this is what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about, it is to create the fabricated rise of some with certain identity characteristics, and to make sure that others with other identity characteristics don't succeed, don't rise. And of course, that creates another provocation within our society. And each group, collectively, gets angry at the other. Because those that were in the majority are now being discriminated against by a collective minority. Almost like how with, one stick, one minority, well, it'll break against that pressure. But when you bundle all of those sticks together, you have an unbreakable, strong force. There's a name for that. And you can break the previous hegemony. Which leads to stage number 4, dehumanization. One collective group will deny the humanity of the other group. Members of the other group are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases. Dehumanization overcomes the normal human revulsion against murder. At this stage, hate propaganda in print, in social media filled with hate, well, it's usually used to vilify the victim group. It may be even incorporated into school textbooks, and this indoctrination prepares the way for incitement, just waiting for that provocation. That match that is dropped in the angry, hate-filled gasoline that we are now ankle-deep in our rooms. The majority group is taught to regard the other group as less than human, even alien to their society. The intersected minority groups, who are now larger than the previous majority group, are told that the other previous majority group is less than human. Both sides are indoctrinated to believe that we are better off without them. One group can become so depersonalized that they are actually given pronouns or numbers than names, kind of like Jews were in the death camps. They are equated with filth, impurity, and immorality. Hate speech fills the propaganda of social media posts. They say things like, something needs to be done about them. That becomes a common phrase. Even Christians stop witnessing to the other side. They stop praying for the other side. And even Christians will just dehumanize the other side. Because the new steroidal Christian nationalist has asked Charles Haywood into his heart, or maybe Andrew Torba into his mind. And now he will no longer witness to the progressive, to the Muslim, or to the homosexual. No, he will just dehumanize them. And dehumanization of the other collective group. Just like what Jack Posobiec has been doing with his newest book, unhuman, where he states that the progressive Marxists in our nation that have been homegrown in Ferrerian Marxist pedagogy, well, Jack then starts to post videos on social media supporting Pinochet and dropping your opponents out of helicopters, and saying that those young people that were educated in our school to be Marxists are unhuman. So, dehumanizing your opponents leads you to not caring about the other person, which is the first tiny step to you becoming a murderer. Jordan Peterson talked about this process in his interview with Joe Rogan a number of years ago. When Joe Rogan asked, and I'm paraphrasing, how do human beings get to the point where they can commit unthinkable atrocities against their fellow man? And Jordan Peterson answered, one tiny step at a time. And he said, you know, if I encroach on you, and I'm sophisticated about it, I'm going to encroach 2 millimeters. I'm going to encroach right to the point where you start to protest, and then I'm going to stop. And then I'm going to wait. And then you're going to calm down. And then I'm going to encroach again right to the point where you protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. Then you're going to calm down. And then I'm going to start again. And I'm just going to do that forever. And before you know it, you're going to be 10 miles down from where you started. And you'll have done it one tiny step at a time. And you'll say, how did I get here? And the answer will be, well, I pushed you a little further than you should have gone, and you agreed. So then I pushed you a little further than you should have gone again, and you agreed. And then Dr. Peterson refers to a book that you all should read. And when I say you should read it, it is gut-wrenching. It's called Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and the Final Solution in Poland. And Peterson says, if you are interested in how this process works, you should read this book. The author, Browning, was interested in how the Nazis were able to train otherwise ordinary Christian men to do mass killings. And the author said that there was a police battalion of middle-aged German men, educated, normal men, educated before Hitler came into power, so they weren't indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. And when the Nazis went through Poland, and they needed to impose their brand of order on Poland, they brought in this rather average middle-aged police battalion. And the commander of the police battalion was apparently a pretty decent guy. And he told the battalion that this was going to be wartime. And because of that, they're going to have to do some pretty horrible things. But that they could go home if they didn't think they were up to it. So there was no direct compulsion or coercion or having to obey orders. The guy who was giving the order said, look, it's going to be awful. You can back out. But the men in the battalion thought, look, I'm not going to leave my friends and my comrades and leave them to do the dirty work. You see, that's how tribes work. And this sounds virtuous in a tribal setting, in a perverse way. And so the author of the book goes on to detail how they took ordinary, middle-aged men who were eventually taking naked pregnant women out in the middle of the fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And these men were physically ill during the transformation process to get to this point. And this was a process, one tiny step at a time. And it started by rounding up Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 65. And you can kind of understand that part, being at war, but just putting the men in stadiums and guarding them. But then they had to shoot some of the men. And then they had to round up the men and put them in cattle cars. It was one tiny step at a time. And these ordinary men were having a dreadful time of it, but they didn't stop. They didn't stop. And this is where you get to the point, whether you're a woke Antifa activist or someone who is a groyper or Christian nationalist who is now beginning to barf up anti-Semitic garbage that will lead to genocide. And Jordan Peterson goes on to explain that there are clubs with certain ideologies that you can belong to, where people holding the new, or actually old ideologies, feel like they can explain away everything. Kind of sounds like some clubs that I know that have been formed in Moscow, Dallas, and Indianapolis. And in these clubs, they can feel morally superior to everyone outside of their club. And they know who their enemies are. And you know what you're supposed to do with enemies. They're not your friends, right? So you move against your enemies. Brothers and sisters, please. And I know some of you are listening to today's podcast and hate hearing this, but you are being manipulated. Please, for the love of God, please think. And you know we're approaching this in the United States right now. And it's like a competition to see who can cross the idiot line first. And 50% of the country feels this way about the MAGA and the Christian nationalists. And then the other 50% of the country feels this way about the woke progressives and trans. So you don't talk to your enemies. You are othering everyone. Just like what you went through with the essential and the non-essential, the masked and the unmasked, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, the supporters for Ukraine and the non-supporters for Ukraine, and now the Christian nationalists, and everyone else who isn't is an enemy. And one group that is definitely on the crosshairs of both the far-left progressives and the Groyper-type Christian nationalists are the Jews. Those of you that are part of either of these groups, you are being played. And one tiny step at a time, being led down a road where taking another step into being someone who might be capable of doing horrible things. You're being manipulated, even if you're an ordinary man. The men who are encouraging you to embrace Schmittian ideologies, which are direct twins of Marcusean ideologies, are manipulating you. And you're on your way to eventual genocide, which will lead to the next number on our list, number 5. Genocide is always organized, usually by the state, and sometimes by the new revolutionary groups that are planning to splinter a state away or that are attempting an Ode-pour canvas-style color revolution. And this is often done using militias to provide deniability of state responsibility. And this is what was done with Black Lives Matter in 2015, and then again with tremendous force in 2020 around the George Floyd reaction. And the state attempted to pretend as if they had very little to do with the nonsense that was going on. Although the mayor of Washington, D.C. made it very obvious that she was not going to allow special hotel accommodations available to troops and the National Guard during the D.C. riots of the summer of Marxist love in 2020. You see the same sort of organization right out in the open with the more cringe elements of Christian nationalism. And where there is a lack of real out-in-the-open organization, the resistance is fabricated through Patriot Front and other very obvious fake Fed-controlled groups, because there needs to be the visible timestamp in the minds of those that you need to have confirm that there is a problem. Sometimes organization is informal through LGBTQ+ gatherings at firing ranges, BLM marches with others, Antifa groups, etc., or decentralized, which would be like terrorist groups. Special army units or militias are often trained and armed. Plans are made for genocidal killings. Arms flow to states and militias to facilitate acts of genocide. And this is where I've explained that the LGBTQ+ community has the highest rate of gun registrations of any affinity group in the United States. And this is because the LGBTQ+ community are being scared to death that the Christian nationalists are coming after them, especially if Trump wins the 2024 election. States organize secret police to spy on, arrest, torture, and murder people suspected of opposition to political leaders. Motivations are created for indoctrinating certain groups through mass media and social media. You can see this develop over the past 10 years in the woke side of things, beginning with the infusing of education and spiritual education with a critical consciousness towards all things white. When I say white, I don't mean skin color. I mean capitalism, meritocracy, arts and entertainment, white Christianity. In other words, all those things that we would call the old way of doing things. And so, as I was saying before, on the left, you're using Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance, and say that there can be no enemies to the left, but everyone that is to the right must be resisted. They must be oppressed. And you do the same thing on the right. You begin secret societies like, let's say, the Society for American Civic Renewal, Charles Haywood's secret membership organization, or the massive Groyper group under Nick Fuentes. And you pump up the men in these groups with thoughts of being the Knights Templar. And you tell them that they will be part of a great movement. They'll be part of a communitarian movement. Well, they'll be living like they did in the old days. And they'll be taking the nation back for God. And that anyone to their left, or anyone that disagrees with them in any way, is an enemy. And that there are no enemies to the right. And that national divorce is the only way. You include men from organizations such as the Claremont Institute and pour millions and millions of dollars into startup organizations and YouTubers who will faithfully push your message. And these dutiful young men will deliver the message of the need for a national divorce, and, as well in the Groypers, anti-Semitic and even Holocaust-supporting slogans. Yes! And so now you have anti-Semitism happening on the left and the right. That's how you get your evil plan into motion, both the left and the right. And as I said on the last podcast, you need both the left and the right for dialectical political warfare. Because you can't have dialectical political warfare without a dialectical dancing partner. So both the left and the right, unknowingly, naively, working for the same thing, Ordo ab chao. But the chaos must come first. Chaos is the change agent. Now, a way that you could stop this from happening is actually enforce laws against sedition to those that are doing this on the left and the right. But the current administration won't do that. They won't actually charge people with sedition that are suggesting that we need to have secession. But they will jail a friend of mine who walked into the Capitol building on January 6th, who did absolutely nothing. But they won't jail Nick Fuentes, who was on a bullhorn on the Capitol steps, screaming at everyone to go into the Capitol. No, they will make sure that Nick Fuentes flourishes. And Nick Fuentes glows with the brightness of 1,000,000 suns. And the next stage of this process is where we are heading. Stage number 6, polarization. And this is where propaganda is employed to amplify the differences between groups. Endless memes. One propagandizer qualifying another agitprop. Now, sadly, I've seen this with Tucker Carlson as of late, even to the point where Tucker has platformed Alexander Dugin, who desires an apocalyptic war with the Antichrist. And the Antichrist to Alexander Dugin of Russia is the United States, and Russia is the Messiah. Yeah, Tucker platformed him the other night. Now, interactions between the groups are deeply frowned upon, which creates tribalism. And the moderate members of the group in power are bullied into silence. By the way, the Chinese would call this a struggle session. And this is what is happening very easily on social media. And I know some of you are saying, Mike, social media can't be used to create a revolution. Come on, really? Have you ever heard of the Arab Spring? Otherwise known as the Facebook Revolution? You see, social media is used to silo groups. It is meant to keep everyone from speaking to one another and finding ways of communicating and having discussions with those that may have different opinions than you do. But they are your neighbors. And in social media, you have instigators and trolls. You have people who will polarize and make sure that allegiances are constantly put at the center of discussion. Well, what happens is eventually stage number 7 happens. Stage 7, preparation. Plans are made for genocidal killings. National or perpetrator group leaders plan the final solution to the targeted group question. They often use euphemisms to cloak their intentions, such as referring to their goals as ethnic cleansing or purification or counter-terrorism. They build armies, buy weapons and train their troops and militias. They indoctrinate the populace with fear of the victim group. Leaders often claim, if we don't kill them, they're going to kill us, disguising genocide as self-defense. Acts of genocide are disguised as counterinsurgency if there's an ongoing armed conflict or civil war, which is what they're trying to provoke right now. And there's, of course, a sudden increase in inflammatory rhetoric and hate propaganda with the objective of creating fear of the other group. This is throughout the stages that this occurs. Political processes, such as upcoming elections that may cost them their grip on total power, may actually trigger genocide. And the sum of all fears is if both sides of the sworn enemies are doing this to one another. Which leads to stage number 8, persecution. Victims are identified and separated out because of their ethnic or religious identity. Death lists are drawn up. Their property is taken from them. Sometimes they are segregated into ghettos, deported into concentration camps, or confined to a famine-struck region and starved. They are deliberately deprived of resources such as water or food in order to slowly destroy them. Programs are implemented to prevent procreation through forced sterilization or abortions. Children are forcibly taken from their parents. The victim group's basic human rights become systematically abused through extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced displacement. And genocidal massacres begin. There are acts of genocide because they intentionally destroy part of a group. The perpetrators watch for whether such massacres meet any international reaction. And if not, they realize that the international community will again be bystanders and permit another genocide. So what will happen is that after chaos and genocide begins, in let's say the United States, then the international communities can swoop in and say, we can't allow a Holocaust like this from ever happening again. It just can't happen on our watch. And the United States will look 1,000,000 times worse than what happened in Syria with ISIS a few years ago. Of course, this leads to stage number 9, which in some ways is kind of crossing into and merging with stage number 8. Stage number 9, extermination, begins, and quickly becomes the mass killing legally called genocide. It is extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. When it is sponsored by the state, the armed forces often work with militias to do the killing. Sometimes the genocide results in revenge killings by groups against each other, creating the downward whirlpool-like cycle of bilateral genocide. And the acts of genocide demonstrate how dehumanized the victims have become. Already, dead bodies are dismembered. Rape is used as a tool of war to genetically alter and eradicate the other group. Destruction of cultural and religious property is employed to annihilate the group's existence from history. The civil wars that broke out after the end of the Cold War have also not differentiated civilians and combatants. All men of fighting age are murdered in some genocides. In total genocides, all the members of the targeted group are exterminated. This may be over in a few months or it could continue for several years. Which then leads, of course, to stage number 10. Denial. Denial is the final stage that lasts throughout and always follows genocide. It is among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. The perpetrators of genocide dig up the mass graves, burn the bodies, try to cover up the evidence, and intimidate the witnesses. They deny that they ever committed any crimes, and often blame what happened on the victims. They block investigations of crimes, and continue to govern until driven from power by force, when they flee into exile. And of course, this is where the United Nations, NATO, or China enters the United States and divvies up what is left of the United States. And of course, those forces must come into the United States because of all those nuclear warheads that, if in the wrong hands, could end up destroying the planet. And all of this happened one tiny step at a time. Now, I know there are men in the Schmidt-pilled, slowly evolving to full integralist world that were my friends just a few years ago. We stood strong side by side against the first attempt at this on the left side with the giant woke and Antifa mobs. They relied on me, and they relied on James Lindsay for a lot of the information that we had created, and we started creating that information back in 2016. But what both of us realized, and what I tried to articulate to the men in 2018 and 2019 that were part of the first stand against the attempt to bring the left to genocide, was that the wokeness in faith, politics, and in everything was a provocation. It was the problem in dialectical warfare. But the reaction would be next. And I explained that the reaction would be an integralist reaction. It would be anti-Semitic. It would be hate-filled. And it would be full of right-side ressentiment, resentment, Nietzschean in many ways. And this movement would be saying that they were here for power. No, not really. It's not here for power. It's here for chaos and to pull many of these men that were otherwise good before they heard the siren song of this nonsense. And some of those in control positions of this active measure might not even realize that this is where it all goes. It is here to start civil war. It is here to end the United States. And it very could well lead to genocide. But I'm counting on you, professing Christian, to realize that men with utopian promises are trying to manipulate you. I'm counting on you, liberal Democrat, who is confused about what is happening around you, but know that something is very, very wrong, to start realizing that we are being prepped for a horrible conclusion to the United States of America. And as I speak today, on May 1st, 2024, the number one movie in the United States for the past 2.5 weeks had been a movie called Civil War. And I beg of you to realize that this is operational preparation of the environment. It is a psychological operation, a psyop, to manipulate you. And the movie, Civil War, was directed by atheist Alex Garland and is produced by DNA Films, a British film company that also produced Ex Machina and Trainspotting. So it's not a conservative organization. Understand that you are being manipulated. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in a massive psyop. The latest psychological operation, I mean, really, is 2020 that far back in your mind? What about January 6th? What about the push for vaccines? What about Ukraine, which was right out of Orwell's 1984? I mean, go back and listen to my podcast from 2 years ago called Hate Week, Russia. I mean, the United States is literally being disrupted and dismantled. We're being pushed through operation after operation. And the reason for this, of course, is we are playing Thucydides' trap. So China and the global south may rise. But it really is up to you. It is up to you to understand the truly incredible gift that our founding fathers gave in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you must stand up, speak up, and embrace your freedom and liberty, and understand that if we lose this nation to tyranny, the entire world falls as well. And I say this without 1 ounce of hyperbole. It is your time to stand. It is your time to be bold. It is not a time to shrink back, because if you are silent, if you allow those that are seeking to end our nation without answering them back, then we will lose our nation. Yes, you will face struggle sessions, no doubt. Yes, you will have people lie about you. Believe me, I've had a whole bunch. Yes, it could mean that you might lose your job or your company or your ministry. So now, standing up against this horrific scenario, which you are witnessing around you, well, that's not necessarily courage. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately. Because the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? And it isn't that I am courageous. It's just I'm afraid of the right things. When I first started publicly speaking against the woke infiltration into the church and into society back in 2016 and 2017, I wasn't as fearful as what would happen if the podcast went out. Then I was fearful of what would happen if I didn't speak out about something that I did understand was happening in the church and as well in society and education with neo-Marxism. because I know where this is going. And I know what happens if we lose this nation to what will be worse than ISIS in Syria. So it isn't so much courage. It is less risky to say what needs to be said and identify the problem than to remain silent when you know there's something that must be said and must be done. And if you don't say something, millions will possibly die and we lose the nation. So you must speak, no matter what the cost, because if you don't, we will lose America. And so with this understanding, I will say to you that we have our 21st century American crisis. And it is up to those that can see through the fog of manipulation to remember that his fellow man was created in the image of God, to not stop at any point from proclaiming the gospel as well, and continue to press for the freedom and liberty that made our nation the shining city on the hill for everyone. May God save America. We must win. I'm Michael O'Fallon, and this has been Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic.